Hello, welcome to the Psychology of Good and Evil. Previously, we covered evidence suggesting that a sense of self figures prominently in the psychology of good and evil. We learned that typically, personal identity hinges on the stability of one's moral values or moral traits. Those persistent moral attributes, like being kind or patient, are what make a person who they are. But how do people who know themselves to be morally righteous, or at least morally acceptable, end up causing harm and violating others' rights, as they inevitably do? In the Moral Self lecture, we covered how morally problematic outcomes like violence are increased when a person doesn't identify with moral traits or values like those listed here. We saw this with the example of psychopathy, and when a person is detached from the self, as in states of dissociation. But psychopathy and dissociation can't explain the everyday immorality we encounter and enact. Albert Bandura's thesis in moral disengagement, based on decades of research in psychology, is that people regularly do harm, and they live with themselves by selectively disengaging from self-sanction to avoid the psychologically aversive experience of violating their own moral traits and values. We're going to cover many ways that good people do bad things because of self-protective cognitive processes. Let's look at some background on Bandura, if you're not familiar. Bandura is one of many theorists on moral psychology that you've encountered, and you'll encounter many more. He also happens to be one of the most famous psychologists. He's known for his classic work on modeling and aggression. In experiments involving the famous Bobo doll, Bandura showed how adult aggression in speech and behavior was imitated by children when they interacted with a large inflatable Bobo doll after witnessing adults doing so. So in this key study, Bandura had 36 girls and 36 boys around the age of 4, observe an adult who was not aggressive, observe an aggressive adult, and in the control condition, they did not observe an adult. The adult played with the Bobo doll in the aggressive condition, hitting it, calling it names, and the children were then observed in their own solitary play session with the doll. Bandura wanted to know, do children imitate adult aggression? Will they become physically and verbally aggressive after witnessing an adult being aggressive? Also, does it matter if there's a gender match between the adult and the child? Bandura showed that both boys and girls, their imitative verbal and physical aggression was increased after viewing an aggressive model. Also, new non-imitative aggression increased when they observed an aggressive adult. And this was especially the case if they were the same gender, so if they were gender matched. This work was really important evidence for the theory that everyday immoral acts and bad conduct should be understood, at least in part, as caused by situational factors, rather than an intrinsic badness in people themselves. So, thinking about these findings, in one sense, the Bobo doll findings might be interpreted as pretty sad, since they suggest that the capacity for violence and hate is probably not reserved for a few bad apples. We all have it. In another sense, the findings may be interpreted as evidence that we can change behavior by changing something we can control, our environment. And we can learn to be good too by observing people who do good. So there's a foundation for positive behavior in learning. Over the years, Bandura has moved beyond his interest in aggression and learning to other related questions about moral behavior in different environments. He's especially interested in moral disengagement with how people can alter how their behavior is perceived with covert changes in their language and the way they explain things. Bandura considers those psychological mechanisms that allow a person to behave badly without losing their sense of themselves as a moral person, moral disengagement. He defines moral disengagement as the processes by which people separate their moral evaluations of themselves from their moral evaluations of others. This means if I snubbed someone, for example, I did it maybe because there was some reason that justified it. They were mean to me, I was exhausted. But if someone else snubbed someone, they did it because they're a jerk or just are unkind. So that's an example of reframing the snubbing behavior with a shift in context. Moral disengagement includes cognitive reframing and many other kinds of contextual shifts that we'll look at. These cognitive shifts and reframing, they allow one's own destructive behavior to be understood as morally permissible. And this allows one's own moral standards to remain intact, even as one personally violates them. Before we dive into several mechanisms of moral disengagement, it's important to pause and note that describing these mechanisms might be aversive to some people due to the natural intuition that explaining evil excuses it. Bandura's theory, and all of moral psychology pretty much, demarcates excusing from explaining. So this is the difference between condemning an act you think is wrong and describing how that act comes to be psychologically and how it comes to be understood as wrong. Bandura, furthermore, is committed to scientific explanation of evil, not to exonerate evildoers, but he's also interested in deconstructing their psychology of evil and perhaps promoting more positive outcomes.